Please be seated if you're standing in our parking lot. Good morning, St. Margaret's, and a very warm welcome to those of you gathered together in our parking lot this morning, those of you that are joining us online here in Lawrence, Kansas, or really around the world. It's a joy to be with you on this second Sunday of Easter. This is even better weather than last week. It's a blessing to be here and to not worry that I'm going to fall over in the wind. So I'm grateful. I'm grateful for the sunshine, I'm grateful for the birds, and I'm grateful for this Easter season that we're going to make our journey through together as a community. What I want to do this morning is I want to talk a little bit about stories. You've gotten to know me a bit, these past couple of years, and what I like to preach about and what I like to talk about, and stories is kind of high on that list. I think it's important to talk about stories, in part because if you were to take a look around our culture, if you were to stop and take stock of where our culture is at, I think you would quickly see that our culture is hungry for good storytelling, hungrier perhaps than ever before. And I use that word hungry intentionally, specifically. After all, I don't think it's a coincidence that the word that our culture arrived at to describe that habit that I think most of us have engaged in at one point or another of consuming a season or two seasons or three seasons of a show in quick succession. The word we use for that is binging. And I don't think it's a coincidence that that's the word we came to. Our culture is drawn at this moment inexorably to really good storytelling. And I think there's a couple of reasons why this is the case. If you recall, over the season of Epiphany, which feels like a long time ago now, but during the season of Epiphany, I preached a couple times on what I described as our crisis of isolation. And I talked about how the crisis of isolation that our culture is experiencing in this moment, it actually predates the pandemic. We were lonely before the pandemic. And then you inject into an otherwise lonely culture a pandemic that requires social distancing, and you've got a crisis that's made exponentially worse. And so, in an era of loneliness, it's not surprising to me that so many of us are drawn to stories. They've been an invaluable outlet for many who want to feel a human connection in a socially distant world. So in part, I think we love stories because we're lonely. Second, and I think perhaps more importantly, I'm convinced that our culture is longing for stories because, ironically or paradoxically, we live in a storyless world. Let me explain what I mean by that. Scottish philosopher Alistair MacIntyre, he once wrote, quote, "I can only answer the question, what am I to do, if I can answer the prior question of what story or stories do I find myself a part?" At their best, stories act a bit like maps for our lives. They give us a sense of orientation, direction. They help us interpret our lives, interpret what it is that we're called to be and to do. Stories tell us that we're not alone. Whatever it is we're experiencing, others have experienced the same exact things. They tell us that our lives, in fact, are but threads in a much larger tapestry. Now, the reason why now, in 2021, we live in a storyless world is I think we've lost a little bit what it means to live a story and receive a story. You see, I think at one point our culture thought of stories as gifts, something that we receive and that we pass on, something that we share, something that we engage in together as a community. where stories are maps not just for our lives, but for our networks, for our connections and communities. But now, we've lost the thread a little bit. We think of stories as identities that we're supposed to build on our own. Instead of threads in a larger tapestry, we think of ourselves as the protagonists of our own stories. And instead of sharing our stories, living them in community, we mostly just consume them. We don't pass on our stories as much as we used to, so much as we sponsor them and package them, download them, binge them. In our search for meaning and truth, we're picking through the countless stories that litter our landscape without realizing what it is we're looking for. And so, yes, our culture's hungry for stories, and yet I worry that after all that binging, we are as hungry as ever. So why am I talking about stories, other than my own passion for them? Well, what I want to talk about this morning is how the story of the resurrection is supposed to be the guiding star of our lives. The resurrection is not a metaphor for our lives. We don't think of the resurrection as a tool for us to make our way through this world. Rather, we're supposed to put ourselves in the story of resurrection. And it is a story. It's a story we heard last week, and we're going to talk about the story this morning. And as a story, it's inescapably human. It's achingly beautiful. And most importantly, it's very much true. So here we are. It's a week later. It's a week after the resurrection of Jesus. And what we heard a few moments ago is essentially the second chapter of that resurrection story. If you weren't familiar with the narrative, if you weren't familiar with the story of Doubting Thomas, and I suspect most of us are, you'd find the narrative to be rather shocking. You see, our story this morning, it doesn't start in triumph, as you would assume, or maybe that you would craft if you were crafting this story on your own. No, it starts in fear. Even though the resurrection changed everything 2,000 years ago, it took time for the disciples to absorb everything that had happened. In the midst of hope, there was still turmoil and there was still doubt. Even though Jesus is again alive, the disciples are as flawed as ever, imperfect, uncertain, and unsteady. Okay, so here we are. Like I mentioned, it's chapter 2 of the resurrection story. And actually this morning it starts a week ago. It starts the day of the resurrection. The disciples are huddled together and they're scared. Their teacher and their friend had just been killed, but days earlier, and they have absolutely no idea whether the same fate is awaiting them. Jesus, though, mysteriously enters a locked room, and he declares peace to the disciples. Now, I imagine this resulted in nothing more than just sort of looks of shock and dismay among the disciples. I say that because of what Jesus does next. Jesus shows the disciples his scars. More than that, it's after seeing his scars that the disciples recognize Jesus. Mysterious as it might be, what we're supposed to learn here is that the hands and the side of Jesus Christ tell the disciples a story, such that without them, they were going to be left in the dark. I'm going to talk more about that story in a moment. And I'll say that you can just simply imagine the joy and the delight that the disciples must have felt when they relayed this story to Thomas. Now, Thomas was gone when Jesus first appears on the day of resurrection, and you can imagine how with breathless wonder the disciples would have shared with Thomas that they had not simply seen Jesus, seen his face and his smile, but that they had known him. They had known him in the scars that were still there. Now, rather famously, of course, Thomas doesn't believe a word of it. It's because of this that, the Apostle Thomas, over the years, has come to be known as Doubting Thomas. It's here, though, that I want to pause a little bit, and I want to talk about Doubting Thomas and how we should interpret his rather famous refusal to believe the words of his fellow disciples. My suspicion is that while some sort of garden variety skepticism probably did play a part in his reaction to the disciples, I'm convinced there's something else that's going on here. I say that because of the portrait of Thomas that otherwise emerges in John's gospel. I mentioned last week the importance of reading through the Gospel of John. If you were to do that, if you were to read the Gospel of John, you would see in Thomas a rather particular figure. He is passionate, if not a bit unorthodox. And he's really not someone who you would assume would ever be given over to doubt. So, for example, in John chapter 11, Jesus proposes returning to Judea in order to see Lazarus. And the disciples, they resist this idea. They're fearful over their own safety. Thomas, though, Thomas dissents. He boldly declares, "Let us go that we may die with him." In John chapter 14, when Jesus explains that the disciples know the way he is going, Thomas again questions things. And he asks, if we don't know your destination, Jesus, how can we know the way to get there? The image that John paints for us of Thomas the apostle is someone who believes fiercely in Jesus, who always wants to be in the mix, who wants to be close, who wants to know how the story is unfolding. So I wonder if Thomas's reaction to missing Jesus comes from a place of wounded pride as much as it does from doubt. Thomas wants to know this story of Jesus. Thomas has to learn that he's not the center of the story, but someone bigger than him is. And Thomas needs to figure out what it means to follow not just a teacher, but a risen Lord. Fast forward to today. It's a week after the resurrection, and Jesus returns to the astonishment and the delight of his disciples. And I love this interaction between Jesus and Thomas. I love the tender compassion that Jesus has for Thomas. There's no indication that Jesus is upset or hurt or angry or disappointed at the doubt of Thomas. No, Jesus simply invites Thomas into his story, saying in effect, take my body. See what the others have seen. See that I am alive. I am flesh and bone. I have risen. See that I have even the scars to prove it. I think the reason for the great mercy of Jesus is that he knew Thomas. He knew who he was. He knew his passion. He knew his heart. He knew his life. Thomas knew that he wanted to be a part of the story of Jesus. Thomas knew that he wanted to understand the story of resurrection, even if he was confused or unclear as to how the story was going to unfold. So in the midst of this confusion on the part of Thomas, Jesus shows Thomas his scars, and he invites him into that story. Now, the reason he does this is because in the end, the scars of Jesus, I mentioned a few moments ago, the scars of Jesus, they have a story to tell all their own. They are sort of like another chapter in that great story of resurrection. They're like another thread in that great tapestry of God's triumph over the grave and death. In that story of Jesus' scars, there's something that Thomas nor any of the disciples would have ever guessed or come up with on their own. It's easy to overlook, but this little narrative of the scars of Jesus tell us something profound about the God that we serve. So what is the story that God might be inviting us into even this morning? What is the story that the scars of Jesus might be telling us even now? Well, it's this. Jesus' scars tell us, as well as the world, about a suffering servant who, though he conquered the grave, carries with him to this day the very scars of his passion and death. They tell us that Jesus didn't stop offering himself on the cross, but is willing to offer himself to us, just like he did with Thomas 2,000 years ago. If only we can have the courage to seek after him with humility and earnestness. Jesus' scars tell us that through the power of the resurrection, dead crosses can become trees of life, and fatal wounds can become images of God's glory. And finally, and most importantly, I think, Jesus' scars tell us that we too can begin to find peace with the scars that we bear. And make no mistake, we each bear scars. You don't get to leave life without getting a few scars of your own. They might be physical, they might be emotional, they might even be spiritual, but we each bear our scars. And because of the scars of Jesus, we can be sure, we can be confident that we're never alone in bearing them. We can be sure that because Jesus was wounded for our sake, for the sake of us, that our scars can be reminders of God's great love and tender compassion. And so let's listen to the invitation of Jesus this morning as he invites us, like he did Thomas, to follow him, our scarred yet risen Savior. Amen.